this writing community. Tonight's program, about which more content-wise in a minute, is divided into two parts. Hi, Laura. A reading by Joan Retallack, and we're really looking forward to that part as well as the second part. And then a transitional moment that Carrie Sharon is going to help us make, that is the transition. And then we'll open it up. This thing will disappear after Carrie helps us make that transition into a series of questions, reminding us of some of the topics. This will disappear. Joan will become part of a conversation. The circle might even get complete. We have, as of the last check, 35 people who are joining us via webcast, including a number of people who are poets and critics and teachers of contemporary poetry. So we would like to welcome them and say to them that after the reading there'll be a chance for them to participate via telephone or electronic mail. And so during the reading, and as Carrie is helping us shift to the next part of the program, they and we in the room should start thinking about our questions. And not just questions, this isn't a press conference. This is a conversation about an important topic. So again, welcome to all of you. The reading will be followed by a conversation, and we'll set that up as we go along. We have available 2 or 3 of Joan's works, and Joan brought a pamphlet, this, and I have it here to remind myself that it's there. No sex. Yet, I guess the webcast people can't really see why that's funny. Yes, NOHS. And what are we going to do that? SEX, but there's some sort of attempt to abbreviate something there. Anyway, this is available as well as 2 of Joan's other books, including a book that will get a lot of play tonight, How to Do Things with Words, this book here. So we hope that you will pick up a copy. And I already have mine signed from Joan's last visit to the Writer's House, so I don't need mine signed, but I'm going to buy another one anyway for a friend. So you'll have to beat me back there. Joan Retallack's poetry and her critical prose and her poetical thinking and her leadership through the Language and Thinking program at Bard and her presence taken together offer us, to use a phrase of hers, a difficult manual for desperate times. Well, anyway, that's the subtitle of her recent book. Its main title is Mongrellisme, Paradigm Press, 1999. And again, its subtitle is A Difficult Manual for Desperate Times. Another recent book of poetry is the very widely admired How to Do Things with Words, Sun and Moon, 1998. She is the author of 4 other books of poetry, including After Images, Wesley in 1995, and a book on and with John Cage, Music Cage, Wesley in 1996, which has won awards. Her book of essays, The Poetical Wager, is forthcoming from the University of California Press this fall. Joan is the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur. Somehow that's so easy to say because you hear it on the radio all the time, but this is different. The John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Professor of Humanities at Bard College and co-director of the Language and Thinking program there. Joan was one of 9 poets, including several others who are here tonight, who read themselves through modernism at the Writer's House in October as part of the Modernist Studies Association conference. And her reading in relation to or with respect to Cage, Wittgenstein, and Stein is linked to the Writer's House website, and we hope that this reading tonight will get you excited about searching out that link and listening, maybe as soon as you get home, to that wonderful reading along with 8 other colleagues. I often hear my colleagues at the Wharton School of Business, different kind of colleagues, talk about out-of-the-box thinking. That's all they say over there. Everyone is desperate there to conform to the concept of out-of-the-box thinking. You have to be, they say, this is a line that I hear all the time, you have to think out of the box. Well, my favorite section of How to Do Things with Words, which turns out to be a section that's going to get a reprise tonight in the reading, hope I didn't give anything away, is the sequence titled Here's Looking at You, Francis Bacon, which is a series of pages with words in boxes. And I'm just going to read the last two because it's so out of the box, in the box. And they look like this, you know, they're in the box, words in the box. Now we think each movement of the body is part of a sentence. Put the I in the sentence in the box. So there, Wharton. Fox, and the last one, fox trotting across the page into the experiment in the woods, the house, the woman, the man, the box, the brain, the joke, with therefore I am. These are desperate times, and we need a difficult manual for them. And here to give us a piece of the manual is our friend, a great poet. Welcome her with me, please, Joan Retallack.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's lovely to be here again. It feels so homey here, and particularly in relation to my thoughts about casting words to the web, something I've never done before. So I have a sense of a breeze that is wafting in from the web. I hope all of you who are out there on the web are in cozy places too. I am going to begin with, in anticipation of where we're going to end up in conversation about experimental or innovative or avant-garde or difficult poetry and its implications for us, contemporary life, and for the classroom. I want to begin with a passage by Gertrude Stein from Useful Knowledge, and it's from actually the shortest piece, I think, in Useful Knowledge, which is called What Is This? Though I'm not quoting the entire piece. What is this? You can't say it's war. I love conversation. Do you like it printed? I like it descriptive. Not very descriptive. Not very descriptive. So I'm going to begin with the newest work that I have with me, and then actually zig and zag back over time. This piece is called Memoir, spelled N-O-I-R, and it is in a number of sections, the first one of which actually I began for an issue of that wonderful magazine Chain that Jenna Osman and Juliana Spar co-edit. They did an issue on memoir, anti-memoir, some other things. Ah, right, of course. So we have most of the team right here. Memoir, one. It is said that it happens even in nature, e.g., during the childhood, the mother might have a taste for film noir and take the child along, i.e., underful, I explained. My machine is hooked up to my machine. Fiction is precisely what they call non-fiction. So to get a bit pre-sonal, it would be necessary to go the other way, i.e., she wanted more than she could say to not want more than she could say. Or it might be necessary to replace all vowels with X. Not idle play, to forgive that we, in the spilt second of a single space, i.e., it is said that it happens even in nature if only the space at the watering hole is large or small enough, the animals, the timing is all that is off. It is that is the problem with the timing, that it is always off, while it cannot be off at all. That is, the he, to be sure that the she did not choose the wrong thing. Given the diversity of forms, that even a soap film or any other minimal surface can, this time, at or on this point, that is, however, not an Archimedean point, that will entirely explode. The wild idea to try to say that I had a wild idea just as a hummingbird flew by, just like a deluxe model bumblebee engine with mechanical wings beating the sky like a wild idea, and a hot, majestic interlude containing profanity, violence, and graphic photos of murder victims before the clouds parted and the sun turned into a coffee mug or a donut. But though over the years mathematicians have been able to prove that every non-interesting closed curve is spanned by at least one smooth minimal surface, or surface, reflecting the twisting of the sun into someone's bird's eye view, or the limits of any horizon always being a point of view, just like the one unflooding here. And then she found that to find one's position on the graph using XY coordinates, one must not replace all the consonants with Y. Memoir 2, the extreme sport of everyday life. How to improve assaults on the gymnastic model begin always with a question, not idle play, that we forgive the we that moves from a trophy to atrophy in the shrinking of a single space. In other words, it is said that it happens even in nature, if only the space at the watering place is large enough. If shot while eating a Mars bar or any other treat with a paper or plastic wrapper in the country where many feared gods and AIDS and elephants and castles, the chapter on catastrophe theory says that if we backtrack along the previous path, there will be no catastrophe this time. This point, however, is not the Archimedean point either. The world is gnomic present tense, this tensile everything happens at once. It has always happened at once and is still happening at once. There really is no other way, and what this means is that our responsibility to the past is indistinguishable from our responsibility to the present and the future, except that to couch it otherwise is to slide more easily off the hook. The world is memory. It is nothing other than visible memory, except for consciousness, which by the time it is formed is visible memory, as well as in the trying to get to the fire. What is on fire? The way to light prop 1 Where is the light? The photon itself cannot point the way. The ice groans, roars, explodes. That is to say, that I had a wild idea as the hummingbird flew by like a deluxe model bumblebee engine with wings batting the sky in a wild idea. Prop 2. To start with a yellow pad, a yellow pencil, a summer song, an orange rabbit, a rare breeze, a yellow song, a summer rabbit, etc. Bring books next time. What is it that you're expecting? These circular semantics, these circular ruins, this offset, this sagittal section, this widening circumference of life, this widening cross-reference, this inference, will this make me eligible for parole? Do you want to say something about that? Do you want to say something about that that makes you look smart? Had in slith ergo not all pressed soma from fresh fruit, to stop fooling around in the middle, you must locate 3 coordinates from which no preservatives, it's all analogous to a walk through a market, stalls the engine, stalls, only employees allowed beyond this point. No attempts to preserve will be seen as a wind that might come and might go unexpectedly, taking certain things away. Quiet little engine beating a pulse across the sky. Prop 3. Pick up your number 2 pencil, write on your yellow pad. Getting to the bottom of potluck, there are limits to everything, but to shrink from forced procreations, he appeals to the penal theory of this century, his century, the century, another example of the way in which a form might not reflect a purported fact. I dropped the tendency to begin sentences with I long ago. Anything that beautiful has got to be evil, true or false. The book is titled Toward Civilization in America. We don't have to look like the neighborhood we grew up in, the people we grew up with. That's the good life. They call it a brutal, dehumanizing crime, a true and tragic story. The movie version was rated for its language and sexual situations, but the memories of my former surroundings returned to the scene of the crime of what if. This is the vocabulary in which you will be locked up for the next 10 years. There is no good behavior. Clause, the memory, tells us that a person is a place. After all, one of the things I live by is to not try to understand how gravitation works or where the force of attraction comes from, but just that a body can make its present felt instantaneously throughout one universe or another as foot swings out off curb and she looks back. It is one of the things I live by, along with something a woman once said to me in a cab in London. The past is right here with me now on the other side of that perforated line. Tear there or here. He looked back over his shoulder and said to me, persist, and what can happen will. I will live by this. I will. She spelled alter, so how does one know she meant alter and not alter? It was during one of those periods when life seems superficially friendly. The more you know, the less indigenous, aquiline twilight of the sort that divides a thought into its subsequent parts. I love every visceral dichotomy, like the mountains we talked about while they mounted there, roasting termites on another continent that I love. I love this definition. Insert here almost any definition will do for the purposes of I love. How does one take in the way Gertrude Stein contradicts herself in all common sense some of the time, but not all of the time, making each bit of startling good sense even more startling? Having done that, I will now correct it. I have a correction book that is an all-purpose correction book. I think every book that I write is a form of a manual, or I hope it will be useful in some way. And in fact, this book, which is called Errata Suite, after it came out, I got a request from a correctional facility in New York to donate a copy, and I think it had to do with the fact that Rod Smith, who published it, it's an Edge book, said that it had to do with correctional systems, and among other things. So I sent them a copy. Never heard back, but the book is arranged to simultaneously be a series of errata slips. So each page, the print on each page has the general size, shape of an errata slip, but each section is also 5 lines to refer to the 5-line musical staff. And so I see it simultaneously as errata and music. And in fact, the word errare, to wander, is related to music. The book is structured also in fives, so that there are a lot of intersecting structures. After every 5th page, there is a page that has 5 fragments from 5 philosophers whose books happened to be in my library when I was writing this book, and I just counted to every 5th book and pulled out, that book, and then found by a series of 5s this quote fragment. So when I come to the section that has the philosophers' fragments, I'll start it by reading the 5 philosophers, and then I'll read the fragments, and then I'll go on to succeeding segments. Read for real, if men spit race upon ras, first go halfway to set in motion inset for suffixed breast, motion of aberration, solo eyes do not hear her, his, her, dislodged utensils insist on liken to elbow, to Old Norse anger's grief erratic, 5th og dim wheel column, for cling, read clang, erratum in farben melody. Read need for read arising from the phenomenon of color. P lies in a plane of 3 points, svidig to svidga, to sidvig, having only letters, syllables, and silence in this written form. Ar, or, art, a, exist for exits, should have been noted. Man, seek, kind, seek, and you shall be followed by 5 blank pages. B, to be spat out later. Read four last line misting art Iran of spoken rhythms untitled. Add a pronoun. What it is has agitated to a strange and not for tensor analytic. Reads as follows, crossing the ford where Emerson saw the sky glad to the brink of fear. Ebor, dislodge, ed, enso, semi-amasia, o ticks of zero sum, ergo blather, to rush, to race, to wander. Read for two large bird aurorious to be in motion, o tu cara, scienza mia musica, varied as were mix up agitatur, not known the man could not swim, and now apostrophe s restored to pronounce the ritual formula, punch in code for teeth, love's savage splendor. Read land and math for lang and myth's urgent isosceles smile. Read foretaste for phrase that could not deny struggle against misery is part of a longer work. Race in Old Norse rushing, raising casual doubt, 60s postulate number 5. Read this is for his is, 5 words in a line. Read ba, bah, read bay. Read basic works of Aristotle for sun's missing particles. Once chiefly fig, now arch, de facto, lush as were. Abelard and Eloise Adorno, Aristotle, Augustine. His words in her heart, rather than upon her lips, correspond to an old need, so authentic modern works are criticisms of past ones. Beloved by the gods, and as such he, so much for tragedy and epic poetry. Hominum dabit, homini, ate patatur, in te queratur, apud te pulsatur, seek, seek. Read for read far head for a missing biographical note. For our read out. Read this category meant to include now cut, error, whole, she, Tokyo, they, origin. For any number can turn to 0 if you are in the right system. A, or A, against, or A, afraid, as in A, growing not to but where in your personal ergo. Read Byron for bighorn. Read she again. Read should read section 2, line 7, Lake 0 in one of those on Mr. C, upper right left corner. Read Mount for Mr., capital S for apostrophe S in C. Professor of Foods and Nutrition, grazing sheep on front line of diagram 4. See lake at end of preposterous claim. Should read other or once understood. He said, be sure to mention I'm local. Cum for sum, ma, la, logical. Read note on figs, body, rouge, mind, noir. For what reply does one make to oil dependence as a form of music? For Gesamtkunstwerk, read Gesamtkunstwerk. Poetic verb for word. This troubled devotion, which I had not, 67 through 73, been singing whole, moving fast, almost motionless simplicity of for seen, whose coordinates are, reads as follows: promised multiples, whole grains, green vegetables, dried beans for cheese and eggs. How can you buy or sell the suffixed variant sky? aghar, aunt, line, para, chapter, no home to go to, they, missing up and down the latter most harmful form to read the chronicle regrets, and now all reasonable dog stranded on causal plane. Should read seemed clear from the movie, the sudden technicolor salute for the chronicle regrets hiring the one who committed the error, or something inadvertently left out to connect all those motionless gestures across time. Failure to find, defined, specific function of or for nature's rerun, nature's fine, unexpurgated gaze to read. Bacon, Baudrillard, Boethius, Bohr. Whereby the human race seeks to recover its right over nature, where possible but to learn ironically to disappear, where everyone comes to witness him seek self, really his seek own death in the gaze, and imposes upon men a grave, limitation of the causal mode of description. And I'm, let's see, I think I'll end now with two pieces. I'm not sure I'll have time for two pieces. Maybe I'll just end with one. Here's Looking at You, Francis Bacon, that Al referred to in the introduction. And I'm going to read it, and actually some of you have the boxes in the audience. So I'll first read it transgressing the boxes, and then when I'm finished, I will ask everyone who has a box to read simultaneously and read out very loud. One reason for this is that this again is a piece that has a kind of an overdetermined form. There are a lot of different things happening in this form, and part of it is that the boxes all are centered in the same place on the page. So if these were transparent pages, and they are sort of semi-transparent, the first few, you could see all of the boxes through them. And I start out with talking about a man on the metro, and I see the boxes as actually being people on the metro, or the way people are seated in boxes on a metro or subway. So we'll enact that, the sort of simultaneity of people on a metro as it's whizzing along, after I've read it sequentially. Here's Looking at You, Francis Bacon. On the metro, the man across the aisle begins all his sentences with, "I prophesy." The Missouri foxtrotter is a three-gated horse. Mars was 36.5 million miles from Earth on September 21st, 1988. Inside the house is a man. Inside the man is a brain. Inside the brain, a box. Inside the box, a woman. Inside the woman, a brain. Inside the brain, a house. Inside the house, a man. Inside the man, a brain. Inside the brain, a bet on a Missouri foxtrotter named Mars Prophecy. There are many jokes about Descartes inside the box, inside the brain, inside the house. Let's re-examine a stereotype. What is it that we think of the man who starts every sentence with, "I prophesy"? Are we sad because the phrase detached itself and floated away? No need to say something about the sky. Some of it comes back, those moments, clear and distinct, a discourse on method in the touch-me-not, assassin, beetle, woods, carapace, skewered prey, recumbent, vine, snake, woods, ant lion, aphids, milked wood aphid, herding ants, red-winged blackbird on edge of wood, marsh, woods, snorting groundhog, the woman, the man, the box, the death of Dee's daughter, his treatise on rainbows, inside the box, the doubt, inside the sorrow, the retreat into Latin, lumen naturalis, present and manifest, inside the attentive mind, attend to the inside, manifest and present. Inside the box, Missouri foxtrot, past Descartes to Ovid, so one or two women can turn into trees. Now we think each movement of the body is part of a sentence. Put the I in the sentence, in the box, foxtrotting across the page, into the experiment in the woods, the house, the woman, the man, the box, the brain, the joke with therefore I am. And now, okay, all right. 3, 2, 1.
Blackbird on edge of wood marsh, woods, snorting groundhog, the woman, the man, the box, the death of Dee's daughter, his treatise on rainbows, inside the box, the doubt inside the sorrow, the retreat into Latin inside lumen naturalis, present and manifest inside the attentive mind, attend to the inside, manifest and present.
Thank you so much. So, thank you, Joan Retallack. Thanks, everyone. I'm Carrie Sharon, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the director of the Writers' House. And as Al said before, I'm just going to provide a brief transition to a conversation that we'll be having in the room and also over the internet. So first, I just want to say again, thank you so much for being here. It's really a pleasure, and thanks for reading the memoir pieces, too. It's exciting to think of that conversation as an ongoing one. So I have a few notes here about sort of the prompt that led to this program tonight. First of all, we were really eager to have Joan come back and read her work. And also, many people from the Writers' House had participated in a conference that Joan had helped organize at Bard College at the Institute of Writing and Thinking, or Language and Writing and Thinking, that happened in June of 1999. So I can see some people here who participated in that conference, and I know there are people out over the webcast, but for those of you who weren't there, I thought that maybe I could take a little bit of time, at the risk of being too descriptive, actually, and talk a little bit about some of the topics that came up. The Bard Conference gathered participants into a conversation, a 3-day conversation, actually, about poetry and pedagogy. And as you can imagine, this is a topic of particularly urgent interest to many of the writers who were at the conference. It was really a conference that was organized primarily by people who are interested in experimental writing. And the people who came together were writers who were working in these modes, in this admittedly fuzzy category, and many of whom are now senior faculty and teachers themselves. And there were also lots of people there who have been schooled on contemporary writing and also just observation of conventional education to question the various economies and outcomes of institutionalized learning. So I think people were coming together to really try and figure out, how does experimental poetry get taught? How can it be taught? And why? Why should it be taught? Some of the questions and issues that were raised at Bard seem particularly appropriate. tonight after listening to Joan read. We talked a lot about purpose and tactics and about the relationship between the kind of experiment or technique in teaching undertaken and the results that come from that. We talked about how texts get selected and how teaching can reflect not just intention but chance. We also talked about the context, the social, literary, and historical context in which texts are written and into which texts and students are placed. And we talked about the possibility of a kind of teaching that understands the reader as writer and the writer as reader. And there's also the centrality of gender, race, and class as lived and as constructed, and how those issues relate to the reading and writing, and especially the teaching of writing. And we also talked, as always, about what might happen next. So I guess this is what might happen next. Tonight we're hoping to continue this conversation after listening to Joan Retallack's work, which I realized is actually a manual in the question of how to teach experimental writing, how to read. I just want to quote a section from Joan Retallack's piece, The Woman in the Chinese Room, A Perspective. In this story, to describe roundness, you may have to think about a square. You may have to retreat from decorum or just spell it out phonetically. You may have to find an oriental Jesus with a vertical smile. You may have to calculate the rectilinear coordinates of a blue, duskless mountain with a distance of a female Faust. I just want to say again, thank you for letting us take advantage of your presence by returning to the subject of the conference. And start with a question. We're going to move the podium out of the way, and I'm just going to sit up here, and Al has a microphone, and so if you have a question, just raise your hand and Al will come and find you, and we'll be taking questions over the internet just to sort of open up the question about poetry, pedagogy, how do we teach experimental writing, and maybe more polemically in the way that we put it tonight, is it better to teach experimental writing in an experimental way? And I think the first question I want to ask Joan is just, how important is it, in your view, to contextualize for and with your students the text and contemporary writing that you teach? So in what ways do you try and provide some sort of a context, and what constitutes the idea of context for you? And before you answer, I'm going to move this back so we can get started.
Is this on? Okay. That's all right, it's closed. So what we have are 3 microphones. Okay. One of them's here. It's going to stay there for a few people up front. I've got one that moves around, and we've got what we call the town meeting microphone,
Can this go down?
which is for
Is
people
it
who
already-
can't get to this or that and would like to just walk up and ask a question or make a comment. And we have about 35 people out there, and there are 2 ways for them to interact with us by asking questions. One is to send a message to the following email address, wh@english.upenn.edu. And I think Heather probably already told those folks how to do that. They can also phone us at 215-573-9753. And you, if you have cell phones, and if you have a problem reaching me, you can call in, and actually it might be easier. 215-573-9753, and I hope you will call. There's some good friends out there, including some people who were at the Bard Conference. So, Joan had some time to think about the questions. Carrie's up there, and I'll be looking for some people who want to make comments and questions as well. So, Joan, thank you again.
Despite the fact that I've had time to think about the question, I will answer it in the following way. I think most importantly, contemporary innovative poetry or experimental poetry is in the way that Gertrude Stein wrote about in Composition as Explanation, actually composing our contemporariness. It is, in fact, a poetry that that is coterminous with its context, and the act of making it is a forming of that context. Now, this may seem to beg the question, if by the question is meant things like how much should we know about the biography of the author, the location of the author, the connections with prior traditions or contemporary movements, etc. And but I don't think it does beg that question, because I just presume that the answer to that question is, of course, one should know as much as one can. It's all of interest. But the context in that sense, the sense of facts that we know about, say, the biography of the writer, is never a substitute for an experience of the poem as itself a form of life that we are entering as reader, as contemporaneous ourselves, and are thereby continuing its making of or forming of the contemporary through our engagement with it. I really feel that everyone who loves poetry and writes poetry should know a lot about many things. I mean, should be a curious person, excited about history, excited about science, excited about theories of mathematics, all of the things that have converged to make our contemporary moment. And where these lines, where the sort of Venn diagrams enclose the limits of what needs to be known about a particular poem, I think vary according to the context in which it is taught and the purposes for which it's being taught.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to yeah. Jennifer wants to respond.
Oh God.
But there are 30 people who need it in order for you to...
In the very beginning of your reading, you prefaced it by saying, all in the same breath, you had the words experimental, innovative, avant-garde, and difficult all together. And then we've added on now contemporary to that kind of list, right? Those things that have all gotten sort of equated. And I guess going along with Carrie's question about contextualization in terms of teaching poetry, what makes the experimental, innovative, avant-garde, contemporary poem difficult, and is it a different sort of difficulty from, how would we say, what's the opposite of that? Traditional, non-experimental? I mean, I'm just curious, is the nature of the difficulty, does that lie in this poetry as being coterminous with its context in a way that perhaps a poem by Swift taught in a 21st century classroom would not be? Is that wherein the difficulty lies?
Joan, I know you want to answer this, but I'm going to do my moderator thing of asking you, indeed, if you have an answer to answer it, but inviting people to speak collectively so that this isn't just a Q&A of Joan, although, yeah. So if Joan might want to start us off with a response, but I'm sure there are other people in the room who would like to respond as well. So Joan,
Yes.
I invite you, certainly.
And
Thank
I'm
you,
very
Jennifer.
curious about other responses, too. I suppose I would want to say that almost all poetry that I would call truly contemporary is difficult, but not all difficult poetry is contemporary. I also want to say that I didn't mean that string of adjectives as an equation. I meant it as a range of ways in which contemporary poetry has been described. I think the contemporary is difficult. The contemporary moment is difficult. It's been difficult for every contemporary throughout history because it has so much that is unprecedented that we don't know how to respond to. And our, habitus, as Bourdieu puts it, was designed for other times. I mean, our ways of thinking, our forms are always moving out of date on some level. These things remain useful for parts of the contemporary, but not all of the contemporary. And there's always, I think, a bad fit between what is new and changing rapidly now, because we are all experiencing and have been for most of a century an accelerating contemporary. I mean, this is all obvious. This is what makes it, I think, a kind of poetical challenge to poets who most foreground issues of form in their work more than any other sorts of writers. And issues of form are issues of composing the language in which you are living in the world in which you live. And I think that's where it becomes difficult, both in the sense of being hard and challenging and being delicious. I mean, I think the beauty and the difficulty are coterminous in work that's really exciting.
Any other responses to that issue? Okay, Kathy Lou?
Well, it doesn't seem to me particularly to be an issue of both form and of reading practice, in that to move this question, not so much to move it a little bit away from like social context, but into use of language itself and reading expectations. And if you're teaching a text that is unseating traditional expectations for narrative or unseating semantic expectations, that requires that you teach a new reading practice. So it's about multiple reading practices and how you can invite students to enter into those different ways of reading.
Heather Starr is taking questions, and Louis Cabri, who's in Calgary, I think, has posed one. Do you want to read it? Go ahead, Heather, you have a mic.
Yeah, there have actually been two questions that are somewhat overlapping. One's from Louis Cabri, who's watching in Canada, in Calgary, and the other one is from Fred Waugh, who's also
Is he right there
in
next
Canada.
to Louis? They're probably watching together. Hi, guys.
I don't think they are, but they're thinking along the same lines.
Okay.
And so I'm going to read both their questions, actually. Louis writes, "It would seem to me that the idea of teaching experimental poetry in an experimental way might default to the idea that the student is in a creative writing class. But what if the student is not in a creative writing class? How can one teach poetry in an experimental way and not assume that the student is a creative writer? In other words, that the student has a special identification with writing as a creative act." And along very similar lines are Fred's question, which is teaching about formally innovative writing different than teaching how and why one might make formally innovative writing? And then should the reader of it do something different than the writer of it?
I wonder if it might be good to appeal to those of us who are teaching difficult poetry in unusual ways to hear about some practices. We did this at Bard and it was very successful. I'll start by saying there's some students, probably about 15 people more or less, who've taken my modern and contemporary poetry course in one form or another, and who know that when we get to very recent material, including Joan's and Bob's, and Rachel's and Jenna's and others, we try to do in this very room experimental things by taking unusual positions, by having a kind of chance operation in the room to create, forgive me, not anything we would call a poem, but some sort of accidental collaboration that would produce a critical result that would be a little more random, a little more interesting. And I think, I'm not begging for my students to say this, but I think at least a little more exciting and more relevant to the work that we're studying. And this is in a part of rejoinder to Jennifer, who doesn't have a mic and can't respond. Are there others who either teach in a way that's suggested by Louis and Fred's question, or people who actually, through their pedagogy, would take exception to that assumption? Others who'd like to speak about this? We have some very experienced teachers here. Bob's half wanting to say, and that will give Joan some time to think about how she wants to say it.
I don't know, this a line from James Cotton's song is intruding into what I'm trying to compose, but don't start me talking. I'll no, it's a tremendously complicated perspective, and Joan and I have a kind of a long and sort of loving fencing match that we've been conducting on these issues, because I always I'm somehow cathected to the non-creative writing student, to the sort of broad, crude social situation of the classroom, with all of its possible rewards, but that are separated out by graded achievement, the triage of institutional classrooms, all of that's hard to escape and difficult to imagine ways out of. On the other hand, it's Joan's vision and practice, the manuals that she does, the way she presents, the way you present this work is very exemplary and really does what I think any teaching needs to do, which is inspire, invigorate, enthuse, and cause one to say, yeah, right, identify with the openness of what you're proposing. So I'm just thinking, though, about teaching a couple of hours ago, teaching Tender Buttons in a crowded syllabus to an undergraduate class where the students more or less did not identify themselves as creative writers, and what the feeling was that, at least that I'm getting from this, is that a lot of contextualizing, modeling of readings, the more that I could do, the better it would be. The better it would be for Tender Buttons, for Gertrude Stein, for them. They would like it more. And what happened, given the logistics, was that I had allocated, dystopian fashion, one class for Tender Buttons, which is a help. Yes, I know. And so I certainly tried to get the kids to, I first was finding out where they were coming from, and basically they found it very, very difficult, and so I tried to model as briskly and uncoercively as possible various reading strategies having to do with erotics, cubism, semantic openness in various ways, and marched through some of the poems, and I think it did some good, but the distance between that very recent experience and some of the assumptions in this discussion is a perpetually difficult and painful one, and I just think that I don't mean to be the bearer of harsh, cold, unpoetic social habitus, but I think we have to be somehow keep the social logistics in mind always, and be aware that, I guess, let me just, okay, I'll shut up now with this question. There may be more than one type of student in our classroom. There may be the identifying enthusiastic student, and then there are other students. And how do we not create any kind of a cult-like or initiatory setup where there's people who get it, and then there's people who are excluded? So that's my question.
I know that Joan wants to talk, and then and Jenna as well. Joan?
I'll try to be very brief. See, my sense is that the traditional dilemma of the academic that you've just articulated is precisely the one that does set up a kind of cult status of those who get it and those who don't, reflected in the grades, reflected in the special knowledge that is very removed from the experience of the textures of the language and the sensuality of the language involved in your example, Tender Buttons. I just want to say that I'm in a lucky situation right now because I have just decided to structure all of my classes as seminar workshop hybrids. I do not teach workshops, I do not teach seminars, I teach hybrids, and they are all about writing and reading and writing and reading and actually making other kinds of art when they're offered in the integrated arts program at Bard. I think that a course at Penn could be offered that way by having whatever the size of the class, by having workshop, seminar, discussion groups in which students are given a chance to enact, play with the work, with their voices, with performative approaches, and especially with writing. And I really feel the notion creative writers just has to be buried. I mean, you know, everyone who is in any of our classes can write, and can write in response, and can be invited into doing writing that surprises themselves in relation to texts that surprise them.
My comment is related to both. It's a Tender Button story also. In that last year, I was teaching a 200 level class, and we spent a day on Tender Buttons, and I had used some of the strategies which I've learned through the learning and thinking. That's what it's called, L&T, yes, learning and thinking.
Language and
thinking. Everybody says something different. Through the Institute, I'll call it that. And I had started off, it was a survey to modern poetry, and I had started off by kind of doing the experiments with poems that we were reading in the course. And then by the time we got to Stein, the students were actually they were leading the discussion themselves, and the woman who was presenting Tender Buttons, she had, in her preparation, she had realized that many of the words in the Tender Button that she was presenting to us, when she looked them up in the dictionary, she realized that there were 5 or 6 different definitions for every word in the poem she was looking at. And she decided that what she was going to do was write definitions on 3x5 cards for every word, and then she passed out the 3x5 cards, and we reread the poem, translating the words into the definitions. And what she discovered, and the whole class discovered, was that there was this kind of subtextual narrative that was going on in the seemingly non-narrative poem. And I don't think any of the students came to the conclusion that, oh, well, this is the right answer. There was just this hidden story that we had to find. But instead, I think they realized that language is something that you can really just, sink your teeth into and just really get involved in. So whereas many of the students entered the classroom feeling like they had no access because of this experiment that a student had come up with, they all left feeling like it was an eminently accessible poem. So I think that these experiments are so good for that, and I was wondering if maybe Joan or other people could mention other examples where difficult texts were taught.
I hope you don't mind if I jump in. Actually, I wanted to respond to that, and also respond to both things both of you had said. I was thinking before this program got started about conversations I've had in the past couple of days with students at the Writers' House, and we were talking about writing in class and the whole notion of taking notes while someone is speaking. And I noticed that lots of people in here have notebooks and pens out, and there's sort of this notion that you're furtively scribbling your truest thoughts while the other person is talking. It's a little illegal or illicit, and in fact, one of the things that I've learned from being at Bard and also from talking to Jenna, actually, is that there are plenty of ways that you as a teacher can encourage your students to do that kind of writing back to the conversation and writing over the text and writing into them. And so I guess in response to what you just said, Jen, I was thinking of just something that you and I had talked about. Take a text that another student has written, even in a creative writing class, and have everyone in the class write into it, so that there's this constant reminder that that's actually what we're participating in, is this ongoing, fairly involved, complicated dialogue in writing that happens. And to just remind people that this is happening constantly. And I think I got that straight from the Institute for Everything. I can't remember. And I know there are other I'm thinking that you, Jenna, have taught me a couple of other strategies too, and maybe I learned them at the Bard conference, things where you can have people read texts as you had the I almost said the class, as you had the audience read your text, sort of in different ways to try and get at what's happening there. But I think one of the tricks is to not feel yourself as the instructor drawn towards the notion that there is a right answer, or that you're hoping to get them somewhere. And that can run counter to your own instinct as a reader sometimes, that you really feel as though there is a place to go. Anyway, I just want to honor all the furtive scribbling, partly. So.
We're going to Eli, and then to Rachel. Rachel, and then Eli.
Hi. I don't know whether this is a third position. Also teaching at Temple University, as Jenna does, and as Eli, who's about to speak, does. It's kind of a semiotic position, by which I mean that students, I'm talking now about undergraduate students, and I'm talking, I think, about people who perhaps come into a contemporary poetry course, not a writing course. It's not a creative writing course. Using a Hoover anthology, which is a complicated thing to do because it has some lacunae and some misprints. All right. Students know how to read a lot of things. They just mostly often don't know how to read the kinds of things that we give them in this kind of class. If you look around, I would bet that any undergraduate student here could give you an incredible readout on how people look, the semiotics of their clothes, just even their sneakers. For example, I could say, a kid would say, "Don't buy those sneakers," and you don't know why they're saying that, because to you they all look alike. So what I'm talking about is making very subtle distinctions that are reading distinctions that have to do with convention and genre that people really know already. That is, people always already know something about these issues. They also know, to some degree, something about convention and genre, although they may not be knowing that about poetic texts. So, there's a strategy that could start with description, very simple, that might lead to a greater understanding of convention and genre and a sort of semiotics of reading a poetic text, that would simply ask a person not to thematize as soon as they saw something, but just to describe it like anything. This has 5-line stanzas, something that already, you can count to 5, but you might not even know the word stanza, which some people use the word paragraph. Very, very straightforward, simple things, because people who don't yet know how to read those texts don't have a lot of language for doing it. But when you describe, you have to make up some sort of language for doing it. And soon you get into, very fast, you get into what I'd call the semiotics of poetic convention via this tactic. And it does build, you can build vocabularies that way. At the same time, you're looking at detail, you're looking at the poetics of detail in a very close way, issues like diction or discovery, various discoveries, like making little bumpy discoveries along the map, the terrain of a text. And I think that's a position slightly between what Bob is describing, although the classroom situations may demand what Bob is saying and what Joan has described.
Thank you, Rachel. And more from Temple University, Eli Goldblatt.
Well, I feel what Bob feels. How do you get don't get Alice? Don't get me started. There's also the question of Penn and Temple and the differences in between those two institutions and who sits in what classes and so on. That is what I think about. And I want to kind of I want to kind of open up the geography of writing a little bit further. The distinction that you were making about, or that list of adjectives about alternative or avant-garde and so on. What I'm thinking is there's reception and there's production, and it happens in many different kinds of classes under many different kinds of circumstances. But I'm also thinking of another distinction, which is unsettling and settling kinds of reading and writing. That is, there are kinds of reading that we both teach and encourage, which is a reading that settles down the dust that's in the air. There's all this stuff going on. I don't know how to put it together. So we may read something that gives us a method for putting things together. But we also at other times read texts that unsettle, that put the dust back in the air, so what we thought we knew, we no longer know in the same way. But the problem that students have when they walk into our classes is they're never sure whether they should be unsettled or settled. And there's also a real distinction between what faculty or instructors think is settling or unsettling and what students think. And that happens both at the reception process and the production process. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a freshman composition class, where what we are trying to teach is how to take a lot of things that are floating in the air and settle them in some way that somebody else will be able to so-called follow. And then in a creative writing class, what we're doing is often is saying, take the things that you thought you knew and unsettle them. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm really just raising this as some way of looking at this. I don't think there's we could develop tools out of that. But I think what I really want to say is that I'm very invested in not splitting off kinds of writing, even though there are times where we need to say, okay, today we're going to try to settle things, and today we're trying to unsettle things. But that's a dangerous thing. All I'm saying is that very often what happens is that creative writing, this is where I agree with you, Joan, about the creative writers come over here, and here we do a certain kind of magic, which has a certain privilege, and as Bob is saying, tends to say these are the people who know and these are the people who don't know. And then we have other kinds of writing which is often stigmatized or felt to be kind of a simpler or less endowed in some way. And those are, yet they really need to speak to each other in many ways. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you, Eli. Joan?
Could I just
Please.
say that I find very confusing those dichotomies. I'm sorry that I do, but I do, because everyone else seemed to understand them. The unsettling, settling, the production and reception, and I actually almost jumped in and asked you to say what you meant by those, but my sense is that you are engaged in the production of meaning when you are reading, which I suppose would normally be considered the reception area, and that you are, you are always in a mode of reception with language, that it's actually a conversation. I like a conversational model better than that kind of bifurcation. And so I'm not sure. I have a feeling that people are often working within what they consider to be such time-worn, given constraints that there's not a sense of the fact that the classroom doesn't demand that we teach in a certain way, as actually that was Bob's term. Here we are in our friendly parrying. You know, when we walk into a classroom, that classroom is not making demands on us. I mean, the room isn't demanding anything. The students have expectations, that's for certain. And like, I mean, someone earlier said a good deal of what can be difficult in reading work that is unfamiliar is that it is upsetting our expectations. But we come into that room with enough power to reshape expectations and to reform it, literally. And that can really have to do with not colluding with those dichotomies, so that you've got the reading going on over here, the writing going on over here, and a notion that you must have an initial response of remove from the new thing rather than entering into it with voice, say. I mean, the first thing that I do with poetry in a room of students is to read it aloud with them, to hear it in multiple voices, to get the sound sense of it. That's an active reforming of expectations that we will first, you know, put it at a distance and look at it with a microscope. So I don't mean to. I wish you were still at the microphone because I may have misunderstood the dichotomy.
Look, he is now.
And I really wasn't trying to set up a dichotomy that we follow in some kind of curricular way, or even I'm really thinking of a kind of moment by moment provisional scan of what happens, and I think that sometimes there's a great surprise in a classroom where you bring something in and you think that this will kind of clarify something for the students who are confused by something. And in fact, it makes them much more uncomfortable. And so, and sometimes you want to make them more comfortable and, or make them uncomfortable, and somebody says, "Oh, I get it now." So there, and you mean this, and that's not really what you mean, but they kind of settled on it, you know. But I'm actually speaking for against a certain bifurcation, which is the bifurcation between expository writing and creative writing, and the sense, but that's a very complicated geography.
Yeah. Yes.
This is Chris Evans, who is a student, so we have our first student giving that. Chris?
Yeah, I took Al's class on modern contemporary American poetry last fall, and some of the things that I found interesting about the course was that we were dealing with a lot of really contemporary, really experimental poetry, and we were dealing with it in an experimental classroom that was kind of a listserv-based classroom where I guess kind of the boundaries between text and the conversation about text really, I guess by the end of the course, started to coalesce, and it started to coalesce in a classroom that was at once in Puerto Rico and in West Philadelphia and all over the world, because there were students, you know, existing on, you know, all these different places. And I can remember before I started the course, I saw, just lift this up. I saw a lecture that Al gave on how the lecture is obsolete. It was a 1 minute lecture, and it was a really good, I guess, precursor to, you know, finding out that the rose is obsolete later on, and with Williams, and you know, and dealing with a lot of the non-referential kind of non-narrative language that we were dealing with, having the format where a lot of students who have never really dealt with this kind of language are dealing with it in kind of a conversation and a dialogue with the actual text. I think it's the only way to really learn that, these modes.
Hi, I'm not a teacher or a writer or a student, but I'm going to talk about all of them. Actually, everyone's talked a little bit about the dilemma in pedagogy within English or within composition or writing, but there's actually the larger kind of crises in academia itself, where there are all sorts of problems with how we construct disciplines. And I'm surprised a little because you talked in your kind of advice to poets, you actually kind of underscored the problem. I mean, you told everyone that to be a good poet, you should also read in history and mathematics and science. But the bigger question is, how do you get people who read mathematics and science to also read poetry? And not only read it, but understand that it's a significant part of their own education, their own lifelong learning. And it seems to me to underscore a real crisis in academia that no one really considers finding a way to have people who are, on one hand, some of them to go through the university merely for vocational training, to realize how important humanities and then specifically poetry can be to their learning. So that's something maybe even more important, more radical to think about than just merely what we do in our classrooms. So.
I agree with that, and the language and thinking program, whatever that may be, that we do at Bard in the summer, that it's a program for all incoming first-year students, is designed to be a kind of microcosm with an anthology that we put together of the liberal arts and sciences, the humanities, including math and science and poetry and all of the usual things in which there are conversations between the arts, including poetry, and the math and the science and so on. And the whole idea really is to get people the few students who come to Bard primarily interested in math and science, there aren't many, interested in poetry and other things, and vice versa. I mean, for the conversation to be a complicated and rich one, and yes, as you say, going in multiple directions.
This is a great question. We're going to take one from far away. It's Alan Golding, who says hello to everyone he knows.
Hello,
he's in
Alan.
Louisville. Alan has two questions. I'm going to read the first one because it's been talked around. That might be Alan, actually. I'd like to shift the discussion for a moment from experimental poetics as an object of pedagogy, i.e. that which is taught, to experimental poetics as itself a site or form of pedagogy. Can we think of experimental poetics as a form of teaching? And if so, what does it teach, and how does it do so? I'm especially interested in what you might have to say on how experimental poetics might enact a pedagogy through its forms. So Alan is putting one out there, and I wonder if anybody has a response to that. I mean, I feel my response is affirmative, but I'd rather somebody else elaborate while I figure out who's on the phone. Does anybody feel that Alan's move makes sense? I wonder how Bob feels at this point. Taking tender buttons not so much as itself the object of teaching, but as a teaching. And you can have the mic while you ponder while I figure out who's on the phone.
Okay. It's funny. I first want to just catch up with some prior things. I want to get out of the position of the pedagogue who does not believe in student writing and productivity, and sort of testify that yes, I think I mean that getting the students to read the poems aloud, and certainly I've taught versions of courses where reading and writing are mixed, and I think that is the way to go. And I'm just wondering why I have this lingering need to, just to keep underlining how the magnitude of what we're attempting in our modeling of this the linguistic and artistic openness, that it's the society that we are addressing with this wonderful, pleasurable power, utopian power, is very big, and our address is still quite circumscribed. So that's what I keep coming back to, that issue. But about the pedagogical nature of experimental writing, I mean, it's there's many examples that come to mind that sort of parry with one another. There's this sort of tragic figure of Pound and what he wants to teach, and how in some sense he models a bit of what Joan is talking about. In many other senses, of course, he doesn't, and is very withholding and initiatory in ways that are very troubling. I don't think there's a single answer to the question of the avant-garde and of pedagogy, and there's and maybe just to turn it to Joan and to sort of kind of do a sort of touch pass from Alan's question and then to ask it to Joan. What is there, and it goes back to that first question of context, is there content that you teach or that would be desirable to teach that isn't simply a set toward inhabiting language in an open fashion and feeling that one is invited in and allowed to enter? Are there, to use, I guess, architectural metaphor, are there rooms or libraries, once you get in, that you then feel like need to be, that it would be good to get the students to go to? So that's a metaphorical way of asking that question about content of pedagogy and how new work teaches content, and besides just a kind of formal openness, linguistic openness.
Well, I want to choose to respond more directly to Alan Golding's question, which in fact had to do with form. And I think that the one thing that one could say about any of the poetries that we use, any of those words, I strung together earlier in relation to, is that they foreground issues of form, partly because they are operating in forms that are unfamiliar, and that the unfamiliarity automatically foregrounds the fact that space on the page is not being used in the way it usually is used, that words are not, the typographies are different, that sequences are odd, and this can be on the visual, graphic level, it can be on the syntactical level and semantically. So all of these things become foregrounded in this poetry. What that means is that if we are to spend time with it, to begin to have a conversation with it, we are going to have to reconfigure the geometry of our attention from the usual way in which the trajectory of our attention moves. The usual way the trajectory of our attention moves is left, right across a page, going down. Many of these poetries actually disrupt even that. I mean, the simplest geometry of reading. I think at the moment that the geometry of attention is in crisis, which has to do also with conversation. I mean, the word crisis means turning. To converse means to turn toward, to get to the end and turn back, to constantly be turning toward. And so we're turning toward this text with our mind, which itself is cueing us to a different kind of geometry of our movement. And reading is movement. It is not just, sitting catatonically staring at a piece of paper. It is moving the eyes, it is moving the mind, and moving the body as well. I mean, there's a lot of work now being done on the hyperactivity of the Renaissance reader. The way people used to pace and engage in acts of marginalia and so on. And I think the form of today's innovative poetry, those forms, in a way could be seen as scores for realizing new geometries of attention. Or, perhaps it would be better to, at that point, talk about choreographies if you're going to talk about scores. But so, yes, I think the answer to Alan's question is yes.
Thank you, Alan and Bob. And yes, I know, but we also have someone on the phone. And can you? This is Joan. Hello, Joan.
Hi. How are you? I got to turn down my monitor because I'm way
Turn down your
behind
monitor because we're on a bit of a delay now.
Yep.
Joan was at the Bard conference. Joan, you're a teacher, aren't you?
Yes. Well, I'm still in doctoral studies, but I'm teaching at State University at Albany.
Great.
In New York.
You were at the conference. We met there. And what? Do you have a question, or can we ask you about the conference and what happened immediately afterwards? Maybe you should just go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I had a comment that not exactly a question, except that I'm really welcoming Joan to add some comments in terms of how the Bard conference has spun off for her, what results have happened, and whether there have been specific experiments or teaching experiments that have developed at Bard or elsewhere. There was going to be an internet conversation that I think didn't completely evolve. We didn't end up having a list, but I wondered if there is a list that has finally been generated, and I'd like to join it. But I wanted to just put in a comment that I was happy to hear what sounds like it's evolving in this conversation at the moment toward movement, toward body movement, toward interactions of other than the more cerebral types, because I guess what I was trying to quickly note down while I'm listening on this delay and trying to catch up to what's been said, it seems to me the trick to encountering experimental poetry is at least partly to remain playful and to take play somewhat even more literally in terms of games, to use games and other types of oblique means of kind of coming at the poetic space and triangulating the experience of reading the poem and coming at it full face, trying to pull meaning and make meaning so significant, to try to pull that out of the poem is one thing, but to somehow play games or cross-pollinate that experience with movement and with production of not necessarily with the seriousness of asking your students to write a poem, but actually to make productions of sound and other things. I'm reminded in particular of how, Al, you and I were in that experimental session where we had a built narrative, and that was a wonderful play with the means of making poetry that I thought was really useful. So I just wanted to put that in and say that I've been using that experience in my classroom and making all kinds of efforts to be more than just conversing with the text, but also interacting in a playful way, and I'd like to hear what Joan wants to add. Thanks.
Joan, thank you for calling. You're calling long distance. You can actually hang up and then listen as it comes out over the webcast. Thanks again for calling.
Thanks very much.
And Carrie is going to respond. You have a separate question. Joan, did you want to respond to Joan?
Well, I'm just delighted by what she said. I will say that the aftermath of the symposium at Bard is still unfolding, We did have a list. We got it up actually probably a month or so after the conference was over, actually a couple of months. And at that was unfortunate. That we should have had something happen instantly, as would have happened had it been orchestrated by Al, who's so good at immediate complex technical responses to things. But we've been putting together a book called Poetry and Pedagogy that comes directly out of that conference, and we are also planning to put a major poetry and pedagogy website up that will have to do with just these issues. And since Al is our numero uno consultant, I think this may happen.
Well, thank you, Joan. That is an exciting prospect. And thank you again, Joan, for making that call. Now we have a question over here, and then JC is going to have one up here at this mic. Thank you.
Hi. In some ways, I'd like to revisit the geography of Eli's question. And I've been thinking about the different discourses that meet in the classroom. And just as there are different ranges and offerings of writing, there's also different approaches to teaching and different approaches to criticism. And I'm curious how you might speak and talk about how one might foster a critical discourse in the classroom that doesn't turn these dynamic open texts into closed pictures of themselves almost. I guess it's a question of aboutness, because it seems to me like so much of teaching and so much of criticism is aboutness, whereas that's what's rejected or avoided.
Well, I'm very interested in rethinking what we mean by criticism, of course, and I think there are multiple models. Obviously, there are multiple models. One of which is the descriptive, contextual analysis that is primarily one of aboutness. And the presumption with that model could be that you're going to sort of finish off a poem by doing that with it, and that unit by unit, first I'll look at this poem and I will say what I want to say about it, and then the next, and then the next. I think there are other forms of discourse that are perhaps healthier, more robust, potentially more generative of subsequent desires to read this kind of work that are in the form of the essay as an exploratory tool of the humanities. I think of the essay as being the sort of the exploratory tool of the humanities that is the form in which thought experiments can take place and radical kinds of conversation with texts and context can take place. And it would be hard right now to answer. I think it would be too much at length to try to answer this in detail. But one of the things that I try to do within a semester in a course that I teach is structure it as though the entire course were an essay that we were writing together. And at each point, I'm asking students in their writing to refer to things that we have been discussing, the things we've been reading, and to make work that has an accompanying ongoing statement that does that kind of textual exploration and conversation. And I do that rather than using the more standard model of criticism, which I almost always take to have to do with a certain degree of descriptive judgment, a kind of closing down, I think. This, I think, is what I'm trying to do is no less analytic in the sense of looking at detail, close readings and interactions, I mean, juxtaposing things in very complex ways. I think it's much more lively in keeping the reader in an exploration of the text rather than a closing down of the text.
Thank you both. JC has a question, and then we're going to go to Charlotte in the front row.
I have a question about putting the text in the mouth.
I'm sorry?
About putting the text in the mouth. For example, as you were reading, and I was looking at the boxes, having the book in hand, it was very clear that you were reading a sequential text, but I was reading an interrupted text. So just using that as an example, I want to, Robert Haas says when we read, by reading aloud, we actually enter the body of the writer. He can take this pretty far, but I'm going to just take it an inch and say that there is a way in which we either transgress against or ride the breath pattern. And that act of transgression, to me, seems to be an extraordinary way in a classroom or in a reading circle to contextualize a text without actually having to, talk a lot about social issues, about racial issues, or about where the text came from. You begin to see how the reader student enacts the text in their own speech pattern or a speech pattern they're presuming. And I wonder if there's a way that you could respond to this, particularly the notion of transgression as important to any kind of contextualization.
Transgression. As you were describing this, I was thinking of music and the term among composers and performers, realization.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, particularly with contemporary music that has indeterminacies built into the score, there can be multiple realizations of any one score.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you think of the poem, and I feel it's always possible to think of every poem as a score, and you're trying to decide, what are the cues that one could build a realization out of. There will be multiple cues, just as there were different cues. There are different cues for the reader visually, just looking at the poem, than there are for the person who is speaking the poem. So I guess my question is, why would any of these actually be transgressions rather than further or other realizations?
Well, that's a question in my own mind too, and yet it seems to me that however plastic a text might be, that as the writer is writing it, there's a certain degree of plasticity that the writer might intend or come to understand as part of the writing, but then that takes on a completely different augmentation when it goes out to other readers. And so it seems to me all that once you enact the text in a non-intended way, where are you with that text?
Well,
Yeah.
I never presume to know the intentions of the writer. I only, even if the writer has told me what they were, I'm not even sure. I mean, I am very happy to discover I didn't know my own intentions when I was writing something, or that, you know, they're not shadowing I think intentions have to do with the production, with the energy that went into making an object that then becomes a public object, sort of without intentions, apart from the interaction with the reader. And the reader's intentions perhaps become more powerful than the writer's intentions at that point.
Well, not having attended the Institute, it's really a great relief to me to hear you say that, because it's not always been, you know, my experience that teaching admits to that.
Oh. There's one here.
We'll take a few more questions. Shalade, and then someone who's emailed in.
I'm not sure what exactly I have to say is a question, because I don't say my field of expertise, but what I know more about is maybe physics. And so thinking about this, I don't want to divide things into camps, but when I was thinking about what Bob was saying, and I just wondered, when you talk about contemporary poetry per se, and you made the observation that the habitus and the ideas and the concepts that we're dealing with are concepts basically from the past that we've mastered. So it seems that even that contemporary or experimental writing in some sense is not, it's writing that's, even though it's contemporary, that's the label, that's the name or the genre that it is, it's kind of not contemporaneous with like our understanding. So it might be that while these experimental pedagogies might think that it might be accessible to everyone, I'm just wondering, because like if you read, like Louis MacNeice talked about he wanted the poet to be like just the man in the street, you know, who took part in everyday human activities. You mentioned something about a poet should know something about like math and physics and, you know, and different theories. I was just wondering, because it seems to me that the contemporary or experimental poetry has to do with being more of the average person, and there's no real such thing as the average person. So it seems that it becomes really atomized, and in a way to find an insertion, or in a way to, it's like learning these different geometries that you were saying, and it's not an easy thing to teach geometry, let alone geometry of language. So I'm just wondering, could it be that it might be too difficult for, it might not be as democratic a process as we would think, that it might be that, like I think maybe it was Wordsworth who said something that poets in their youth begin in gladness, where if it all ends in despondency and gladness. Could this be, and madness? could it
Gladness,
be that
madness, what's the difference?
Could it be that it's because to be truly experimental, you have to be removed from your time? Because I mean, I read some poems by WCW, William Carlos Williams, and they were written in 1920, and they seem just to be in language we're using now. So might this be something that people might not want to? It might just be difficult to insert yourself in such a mode.
Thank you, Shalade.
Well, a lot of very good questions built into that. I think I don't believe in the average person. I've never met one, you know, and I also don't believe in a democratic notion of education that rests on the idea that there is an average person. The way in which the contemporary poet is interacting with the contemporary world, I think is not, and now I'm using a ridiculous abstraction. I mean, there is no such thing as the contemporary poet, but let's say contemporary poets whom I find interesting are reacting to it very much in the context of their everyday lives and the forms of their everyday life. I mean, just think of what the form of your everyday life is. You
I don't
live
think you
in
want to think about Shaolin.
an urban environment where you're constantly moving through multiple languages, a kind of, ambience of sounds, sights that come from all over the globe. You are actually intimate with what is going on in the rest of the world every time you turn on anything electronic. I mean, just as we are here at this moment. You're very concerned with things that only you know about, very private things. At the very same moment that you are at an intersection of things that concern people all over the world, and those things are feeding your senses and are clothing you and have to do with what you eat. And I mean, there's a complexity of the forms in which you're living now that I think the kind of poetry that we've been talking about at its best draws on in ways that, again, to talk about geometry, foreground these intersections and foreground ways of finding patterns in what might otherwise seem overwhelming, an overwhelmingly diffuse kind of experience. So I think that the reasons why a person might feel daunted by contemporary poetry don't have to do with their insufficiency. And I mean, say any student at this institution or almost any other, or their averageness, which I don't believe in. I think it has to do with the pedagogy, not having been risen to the occasion. That in the classrooms where the best teachers I know teach, their remarkable connections occur with work that at first may have seemed opaque and completely unreadable. So I don't know how else to answer except, and I don't think you should take me on my word. I think you should, take one of Al's classes.
Might be too late for
Possibly one of
Shaolin.
Bob's.
The physicist. We have two more questions or comments, Joan and all. One is coming from afar, and Heather's going to tell us about it, and then one from afar within the space, and then
All
we'll
right.
wrap up in a moment.
Actually,
or two.
can I just
Yes, of
add
course you
one
can.
little addendum?
Please.
The first thing that I thought about when you said you were a physicist was Niels Bohr's essay entitled Atomic Theory and the Description of Nature, in which he says, now that we have quantum mechanics, we have to think of an entirely new way to describe nature. And I mean, that's, I think, another way of saying what the role of poets needs to be in a world that is so different than it was even 10 years ago.
Heather?
Christina Spiesel, there have been several questions, but Christina emailed in a little while back. She's writing from New Haven, where she's an artist who teaches visual persuasion to third-year law students, and she's employing a lot of the techniques that she learned as a faculty member at Bard. And she writes...
Sounds like a ringer question coming from a Bard faculty member.
She writes, isn't part of the problem the traditional separation between creative writing and the study of literature? I realize that I am soaked in the practices of Bard's Institute for Writing and Thinking, but I would ask more traditional pedagogues whether the study of literature would not be enhanced by an experiential component, be it writing, performance, or the other strategies alluded to by Joan. Why do the experiential things seem radical?
Would anyone you don't have to characterize yourself as a, what was it, traditional pedagogue? To answer, to respond. But does anybody want to respond? Let's radicalize the question. How could you say no to an experiential component to teaching this? Give me one good reason why we shouldn't use an experiential part of this. Okay, here's JC. Go ahead.
I would argue it, but I'll give you an argument. It's not measurable.
It's not measurable. You can't get an outcome. Good, that's one. Is there another? Surely there must be others.
They're different for everyone in the class, or in the group, or in the response. Like if it's not
right.
one piece that you're conveying to a group as a whole, but if it's experiential, it's unique for each person.
Right.
And that way it's not comparable to the way other disciplines do their work, right? So when you compare across the disciplines, you can't say, oh, we're doing in our poetry classes exactly what they're doing in their physics labs or their chemistry classes.
Right. And that's literally, you're speaking like a dean might, as a dean might. Vic's going to be a dean someday. And no, Nick's. And that's Bob, who's the associate chair of the English department, must hear that in the dean's office. How can you bring this to the table when we have all this measurable stuff, comparable stuff? You can't do this apples and oranges thing, which is a version of what JC said. I think there's also another enemy structure out there. Take that, Eli, while I'm talking. I think there's also another enemy structure out there, and it is the old agrarian semester. You know, the structure of the university semester, and this university and most others, even the progressive institutions, are stuck in a semester system. And this is stuff that probably isn't done well in 3 months. Bob was talking about, I think the phrase was marching through tender buttons, because we had to get to the next day's class. We teach anthologies, and I'm committed to teaching a version of an anthology, but the semester is not the right structure in which to do it. I think one way in which you do something experiential is to actually experience time and space the way we normally do outside the university, which isn't by the semester. And since nobody has sort of brought in the writer's house into this conversation, I'll just throw it in. Because I think one of the reasons why many of the people in this room founded the writer's house was to see if within the semester structure, the curricular structure, we could create an experiential non-semester, so that the relationships that are between and among teachers and students in this room, including teachers from other institutions who regularly join us and who sometimes join us digitally, we have a relationship that isn't based on marching through tender buttons on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. It's based on walking through or experiencing the tender buttons that gets talked about week in and week out over a period of semesters. There's literally a person who lives in this house who is a poet, who's probably been thinking about Stein one way or another, who took a course from Bob, who's taken a course from me, and who's talked about Stein, literally, with probably half the people in this room over the course of 4 years. And that is a different form of experiential education. We're probably always going to be stuck. Even Bard is stuck to some degree by having a moment in December where they all go home to their homes not like Bard. And then they come back. And it seems to me that those are the sites of the crime where you get to learn reading left to right, and you never actually learn to read any other way. And revisiting the scene of the crime in a classroom is a way of having to be in the very place where you learn left to right and having that awful feeling of being told to try something else. So if you march through that, it's obviously going to be difficult. How you doing, Eli?
I'm fine. I think I just wanted to say something about experiential learning, is that there's always experience going on in classrooms. It's just that a lot of the people in a classroom often aren't having a very good time. And I think that some of it is the way we teach teachers or don't teach teachers to teach, and especially in college, is teachers are taught to be professors. That is, they stand up and profess, and that's when people often have bad experiences in the classroom, because they're just their experience in the classroom isn't being taken into account. I wouldn't say that necessarily a class where people write poetry in response to the poetry they read is any more experiential than a class where they do other things related to the poetry. but I think that the other thing is that professors are trained in specialties, and they don't want to do other than that which they've published 2 books on. And so very often they're afraid to do things that they weren't trained to do. And that's a very hard thing. I don't know how you solve that problem at the macro level.
There's fear all over the place in a situation like that.
Do you mind if I just jump in for
Jump
1
in, but
second?
we are running out of time, and we have a
Okay.
fellow back there who wants to ask a question.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I
Kate.
just want to say, I guess I want to state the obvious in a way, because I'm still thinking about something you said earlier, Eli, about teaching at Temple. And I've taught at Temple. I've taught the Composition 50 class, and I've taught the Composition 50 race writing class, and I've taught business writing, and also creative writing, series of creative writing classes, and a literature class. And I remember from that experience receiving lots of received information about how to teach. And at the same time, I was also encouraged to try and develop my own pedagogy. I don't want to knock Temple as the only institution that's doing this, but I think that the idea of difficulty actually adheres not only to the poetry that we're talking about, but to the act of teaching. That in fact it's tremendously difficult to position yourself in the classroom as an instructor in a way that allows people to be critical. And it is a constant, and you find yourself allied with the deans, or you find yourself allied with your mentor in a composition class where you're a graduate student and you're learning how to teach, or you're in a creative writing class and you're allied with the notion of the artistic type. And you have to constantly, not in the sense of self-flagellation, but you have to constantly be questioning what kinds of decisions you're making. And I don't think that stuff should ever go away. And when I think about Writers House and the idea of teaching outside the classroom and getting rid of the 3-month semester, I think, yeah, that's true, but I think the real difficulty is when you get away from a place like Writers House and you find yourself confronted by the language of People magazine. I mean, to me, that's the real horror of the world that we live in right now, is that we're constantly being taught to think in such tremendously powerful and insidious ways that's the real drama that we have to, in a way that we have to constantly experience and feel and take into the classroom. It's not, I don't think there is an average person, but I know they're really trying hard to make me into one. And so, and I think that they could be me tomorrow even. So I feel like that, what you said just made me realize how much that's an ongoing problem. So.
Thank you. And all the 20-something editors of People magazine studied under the semester system, no doubt. And we have I don't know how much of a non sequitur it is, and I apologize if you've been structured into a corner, but we welcome your final question, and then we'll wrap up very briefly and thank everyone.
My name's Ian. I was thinking about the question of teaching tender buttons to undergraduates. And a student is sort of trying to construct a discursive response or critical response to a text that constitutes achievement, and does the sort of silence of the undergraduate to tender buttons maybe signify a defeat of the traditional discursive response? And what would that mean? Cage talks about reading Finnegan's Wake as if you were a pebble in an ocean. And would the pebble symbolize an exemplary response to the defeat of discursive responses for the student?
Since it's a Cagean question, maybe a Cagean poet should be asked to answer. Or you could just be cagey.
Well, it strikes me that that's a lovely image and that it needs no response. It would be lovely to pose this to students. I want you to experience tender buttons as though, with your mind, in a way analogous to experiencing pebbles in the water with your feet.
On that cagey and Cagean response, it's time to thank Joan Retallack, who's joined us from a distance today. This was great. Both parts were great. And also thank everyone here. Most of the folks in the room participated. 30 or so people who are out there in various places in North America. I think we're confined to North America this time. Aaron Couch for having done the tech work. Thank you, Aaron. Heather Starr for taking the questions. Carrie Sharon for helping us make the transition. And all of you, and in fact, there is a reward. The reward is that we have dinner that's probably enough for everyone here, not you people out in webcast land, because it's very hard. We haven't figured out how to get the Indian food out through the wires. But if a number of you can stay for dinner, we would love to have you join us. Let's thank, in any case, once again, Joan Retallack. This was great.